So our goal is to take those provocations and turn them into conversations. So we'll invite all three of our speakers up front and give you the choice of running this show the way you'd like it. If there's some quick interaction that you want to reflect on or interact with, that's fine, or we can open it up to the floor. But it's your show to run from a conversational standpoint.
Let's engage the audience.
Okay.
Be my vote.
So who's the brave soul that gets us started?
Oh, well, we can go.
Yeah, go ahead, Arnie.
Yeah, I guess I was a little surprised by the last presentation. I guess as a basic scientist, I've always viewed technology as empowering and revolutionary in a way, rather than something that's defining. I think of virtually every basic scientific advance, at least in my field, seems that a technological advance was prerequisite in some way for gathering new kind of data. Furthermore, even thinking of it in a political context, when you only think perhaps of the recent revolution in Egypt, which was aided and abetted by technology movements, and I wonder, I guess, that.
Should I respond?
Of course.
It was named after you.
I was a physical chemist before I became a philosopher. So, and I had a great in the '60s. I was raised in England, and we were all influenced by what Harold Wilson used to call the white-hot heat of the technological revolution. So I'm familiar with that kind of Enlightenment penumbra to modern technology. But unfortunately, I'm also familiar with for example, the thing I mentioned, and that is the way technology can be used in a destructive way, and the way it was used in town planning, not only in the city I was raised in Liverpool, but also in Cincinnati here, when the West End was annihilated to make room for I-75, piece of technology, but there was no consultation with the people who were displaced as a result of the application of that technology. So if you look at technology within the confines of the wonderful work that technologists do, it looks very exciting, and it's interesting, and it's intellectually engaging. But when you look at it from a wider political and social context, I think very frequently it comes along with messages of liberation, and the reality is otherwise. Like, take, for example, the application of machinery or so-called labor-saving devices like the washing machine. They were supposed to, like, machinery was introduced into the factory with the aim of minimizing labor, and so people could work instead of a 40-hour week, a 20-hour week, and the rest of the time they could be Renaissance man. You know, that was the promise. And instead, what happened is that the machine was put into the factory in a socio-political context in which half the workers lost their jobs, and the rest who had jobs had to work harder. So when you look at technology in these wider social and political contexts and think of it as a political tool rather than a functional tool, I think you've got these competing images. I think you have the Enlightenment promise, which says it's really going to. I mean, they really believe that through technology we were going to become better human beings, not only materially but also morally. But then when you look at the reality of when the technology gets applied, I think very frequently it's very disappointing. Well, there are a couple of examples, yeah. There are some examples where it's used for the good, but there are also many examples where it's, I think, has different consequences. And I think both have to be balanced. I think there is a struggle within, if you want, like, within the application of technology between, it can go either way. It can be reinforce authoritarian structures, or it can reinforce democratic structures.
I think technology is neither good nor evil. I think that it's enabling, and depending upon how it's employed by the individuals employed, determine the character it takes. For me, you say it's enlightening. Well, think about fire, right? Fire serves to protect you, serves to heat you, serves to give you light, or you can use it to burn down things, and you can use it to hurt people. You know, there's nothing inherently wrong or evil or has a set of values associated with technology. The problem is not the technology. The problem is the people who implement the technology. And I think saying that we shouldn't develop technology because people can't be trusted, I'm not sure how I can agree with that.
I'm not saying that. I am saying that, you know, there's a good argument, I think, to suggest that some technologies, like nuclear power, are going to be inclined towards require more authoritarian support structures than other technologies like solar or soft technologies, which would be more decentralizing. Now, we don't, and so those considerations, those social and political considerations, should be weighed in when we're deciding which kind of technology we prefer. If we prefer to live in a democratic society, then I think we should choose those kind of technological structures that will strengthen that society, rather than a structure that we will always have to be, worry about. I mean, I would not like to live in a society which uses a dangerous technology like something like nuclear power if there are not certain safeguards involved in protecting that technology, which you wouldn't need if you were using other types of technologies. I agree with you. I don't think, where I disagree with you, I don't think technology, in saying that technology is neither good nor bad, I think some are valenced in one direction, one social political direction, and others in another. So I guess I would say that some technologies, from a political perspective or the perspective of a democratic perspective, are better than others.
But if you take something like, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but if you take something if you take something like nuclear power, and you say, all right, I'm going to supply the energy for half the eastern seaboard on maybe the equivalent of 20 square kilometers of land, and I'm going to be able to put nuclear power plants, put the security in place to cover to provide all the power for it. Or instead, I'm going to put solar cells out, and I'm going to cover the entire landscape of it, displace all of the ecology associated with the landscape, create a visible eyesore which impacts large numbers of people besides just the people around it. I think it's not quite that simple.
Right.
I think that the issues that you're discussing are just like the issue of displacing the people on the west side for creating for putting in the highway. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming that was put in before NEPA was required to before they're required to do a consultation. Right. But when the decision is made, it's not just displacing of maybe 1,000, 2,000 people whose lives got displaced. Then you say, well, we're going to displace 2,000 people. How does that equate? How does that equate to the economic development that occurs along the entire corridor? How does that affect the lives of all of those people? It's not quite that simple.
Right, I agree.
And it's very easy to isolate a technological activity around a small little bubble. It's kind of like doing thermodynamics, and you can define how efficient the system is by depending on where you draw the circle. Mm-hmm. And if you define it at certain places, you can get different answers. Mm-hmm. And for me, the best, it's not quite that simple. Right. Anyway, I'm done. Yeah.
We're going to try to. So our colleagues who are watching this on stream, I'm just going to run these around so we pick it up on mic.
All right, great. The question is technology and medicine. I've had the advantage of working on a life squad where we started administering TPA 10 years ago.
Good for you.
My question is, if you have a runner out running and that person falls down and a life squad is called, when will we get to the point where we can have a chip on a person that shows their history, for perhaps a prior stroke with prior TPA?
Yeah.
Will we ever be able to put a chip on a human being ethically, whereby that data would be available?
I'll give it a Ouija
Medical, yeah. I don't know when it's going to happen, but I think it's a great idea. There's certainly a demand for it from emergency physicians, so that emergency physician information is key. How about on Facebook? How about if you post it on Facebook? And give your, instead of carrying it around with you, put it to the cloud. I mean, there's no reason for you to have a chip embedded in you, right? Just make sure that any emergency physician could then consult that cloud with your permission. That's probably how you get around HIPAA, is put the information in the cloud, make sure that you have some kind of consent to get the information. And integration of information in bioinformatics is key, I think, to promoting human health, particularly for emergency medicine. I think it's a great idea. I'm not sure about a chip, though. Why do we need to do that? We don't need to do that.
Actually,
I think we're beyond that.
It's done in the military. They have dog tags now, which they put the medical records on the soldiers. So on the dog tags, they have the medical records of soldiers.
Carlo, you mentioned earlier that technology has no values, but in a global economy, if a country X decides to clone human beings, is there a limit to the values of technology, or there should really be no values?
Well, there's two things. These questions here. First off, what's the technology that you're talking about? You're talking about the technology of engaging in cloning organisms. You're engaging in cloning organisms can have some really valuable alternatives. For instance, you get a prize cow that produces 50,000 pounds of milk very efficiently. You have that you want to clone a specific organism for a different plant that has certain attributes, and you want to clone them. The problem is not the technology associated with the cloning. The problem is in how it was applied by individuals who shouldn't have applied it. We presume shouldn't have applied it. I mean, the issue is not the technology, it's how the technology is being used.
I personally would like to see a debate before the technology is applied or used. And I know we are trying to integrate that in our curriculum in biomedical engineering, is to try to have ethics embedded in that so that there is a healthy debate before, because everyone has their own unique perspective. And I would love to see us embrace that as faculty, to engage in debate before the application of the technology.
I mean, I agree with that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to address one of your points that you made about the technological changes to the quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
And my husband, who's a confirmed Luddite, and I have this conversation every single day about how awful technology is because we don't have a life anymore, or at least that's how he feels. I'm sort of more on the other side of things. I guess this is sort of a philosophical question. Should we maybe be teaching our students and maybe ourselves about appropriate technology behavior? I'm just sitting here thinking, listening to everybody. I mean, there's people in this room who are checking email. I mean, this has taken over our lives in a lot of ways. When do we teach our students how to sit and think, how to read? And technology is great, but only if we can preserve some of the things that we hold near and dear to our lives. And I'm wondering about maybe the ethics or the politics of teaching technology behavior to our students.
There's a very good psychologist at MIT, Sherry Turkle, who's done a lot of studying. She does therapy with around these issues, and she talks about how people are connected yet disconnected. So they're in this room here, and I mean, when I first saw modern cell phones, I remember there was an episode at the airport about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and this guy was talking to himself. And my immediate reaction was this is strange behavior. But then he wasn't talking to himself, he was talking to this invisible person at the other end. I mean, that's just a small example, I think, of how expected behavior changes as new technologies come along. And we have to decide, I think, whether we want to impose the expected forms of behavior that we already have, and that is, when you're having a conversation with me, you talk to me, or I talk to you, and there's not, you're not also somehow connecting with your network, or whether that's okay because modern technology makes that more possible. I personally do not use much technology in my classes because I try to engage the students and get them to. I mean, I know Blackboard's been a great service, and I do use it because I can get texts a lot cheaper that way for my students, and I don't have, textbooks can be very expensive, and it helps in that way. But I do find the old-fashioned lecture and discussion, especially in philosophy. I mean, it's different for you guys. You're doing a different type of discipline, but in something like philosophy, I don't think. You can use technology, but it's not, sometimes it can get in the way, because you want to debate, you want to discuss. There's no right answers in philosophy. That doesn't mean that everything is a load of kind of aimless opinion. I mean, there are ways of, there's a discipline to philosophy which you can learn, but it doesn't mean that you learn it by discovering it, by coming up with the right answer. So technology, I think, can get in the way more in philosophy classrooms than in other classrooms where I'm sure it's very vital.
I had an interesting experience last week in which we used an audience response system that engaged their cell phones, smartphones, in order to engage with us on stage. And the take home that I got was you can use technology to fight technology. At least I knew it's like my toddlers, right? If their hands are busy, they're not in trouble. Well, their hands were busy engaging in the information we had on stage, and the minute we stopped engaging in that audience response system, then they were back to their emails. So you can also use technology to fight technology very effectively.
Read an interesting article years ago about, it was an editorial from an 1890s newspaper that talked about this person was very concerned about the young people using bows and arrows. They were making bows and arrows and mimicking Indian warfare, the little kids playing, and they were saying that this technology was really going to destroy them and make them be vicious people. And I think there's similar stories when the telephone came out, and similar stories with the TV, and I think we're going through that phase of wondering about it. But the thing about technology is it's moving so fast past all of these opinions. You know, as we're having opinions on this, technology is moving past that. So my question to the gentleman about the molecules and doing the different things with the molecules, can you, you know, in your private time when you're dreaming about how this can move ahead in the next 5-10 years, what are some things that you envision? Do you see living computer systems, that kind of thing? Do you see?
I have a whole talk. It's called the Borg talk. So, but it's. I think that ultimately, what's going to end up happening is we're going to be able to engineer fixes for many of the ailments that people have. That we're going to engineer materials that mimic the production of insulin and do all the sort of things that currently we crudely deal with insulin pumps and an entire infrastructure. That's what I think is going to happen. I think that the ability to impart a subset of the life processes inside something that has the consistency of a contact lens that you place in the body, and then it drives its own energy from normal nutrients that the person eats and runs it, and basically this mimics that functionality is where I think it'll all end up going. It'll take 50 more years, but you know, that's where I think it'll be, and that's far better because the repair, instead of being something that's mechanical, is something that's living and biological. It becomes part of the individual. So it's the little video you saw with the sinoatrial node in the heart. So right now you have a choice. If you get sick sinus syndrome, which many of you will get when you get older, in which you require a pacemaker, instead of having sick sinus syndrome and having a pacemaker installed in you, having a system which doesn't really respond to the changes in your physiology, but responds to accelerators, never really works right. In terms of if you have, especially if you're an active individual. Instead, you inject in that one little spot a small bunch of material that then goes and replaces the function from that group of cells that died. And I think that those kind of repairs on a biological side are going to become very, very real. On the area of will I be able to make a sentient object, an object which is self-aware. I think ultimately you'll be able to do that. I had 2 PhD students who spent a year doing mathematical modeling of the system, and you can get the rudimentary logic operations being done with those groups of vesicles by having the right coordination number, right size distribution, and several other things. So if you're able to do that, you should be able to make decisions that respond to the environment, kind of like that neutrophil you saw running around. And that's why I show it up there. That neutrophil is responding to a set of very, very simple signals, and the way the signals interact with each other, it's making decisions that have that have, at a larger scale, higher opportunity. If you look at, a biochemist will say, oh, well, it's following the chemotaxis and it's just following the concentration. But think about it. Oh, it's following the concentration. It's doing it for a purpose for the organism to get food. It knows that. It does all these things because there's actually information. We tend, as scientists, want to reduce what we're looking at with such granularity that you lose track of what's really happening and what's going on. And the example which I showed you of those 7 molecules that interact together, trust me, I could lay out all those molecules down there, and the biochemists will tell me what the KDs are of those molecules. They'll tell me what they bond with, but they won't talk about what the information that's being passed between the individual molecules. And that's really what life is all about. It's about understanding how you get access to the passing of that information. And we're just scratching on the surface now to be able to do that.
We'll have one last question here and then one final.
Just a quick question. Going back to the discussion you had about politics and technology, I think another question we need to ask is the connection between economics, money power, and technology. For instance, you talked about people on the West End being displaced by technology. And Carlos said, yes, it also led to some economic development, but not of those who were displaced, right? So who gets to decide whose economic development takes precedence over someone else's displacement? That's something we don't usually talk about.
I agree. That's the question. And I think the quote I used at the end was designed to be kind of open-ended. It didn't answer that question, but it did suggest that we realize that power, this is why I think the work of somebody like Michel Foucault, who's a philosopher, God bless him, and a historian, and not a technologist, but he did some very interesting work on the emergence of disciplinary institutions in the 19th century. Okay, things like hospitals, factories, armies. Populations had to be organized. Okay, capitalism was just emerging out of kind of feudal societies, local communities, and they had this problem of how to organize these, unruly, in their eyes, unruly population. The English were trying to figure out how to deal with the Irish who were coming over and, doing all the work for them, and they had to kind of keep them in their place because they were a different type of culture. So they developed these techniques of discipline as ways of technologies, So, for example, take schools. I'm old enough to have been educated in a school which had more to do with disciplining than with educating. But it was a way, you had to go to school. Laws were passed that said you have to go to school. Your children have to go and get educated. Now, my parents didn't have anything to do with passing those laws, but they had to obey them. Okay, so you're right. And this is what this idea of a planning society rather than a planned society. For all the doublespeak that we have in economics give to the marketplace and what have you, this is a heavy top-down planned society that we live in. People on the ground do not make the important decisions. We live and we are raised in institutions which by educating us, keeping us healthy, giving us certain goods, are also training us to behave in certain ways. Okay, that's the kind of the message I think that comes out of this. Now you might think that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's a separate issue. But I think what I liked about the quote at the end that I gave there was to realize that politics can come in the form of bricks and mortar. Okay, and we usually or come in the form of semiconductors and wires, and we usually don't think that way. Okay, so I think it's good if people start, whether technology is itself neutral or not, at least start to think about this idea that power gets embedded. We're used to thinking of power politically. We think of power in terms of representative institutions. Okay. What the point is being made here, and that Foucault makes, is that there's this other power that we tend to ignore or overlook, which controls our lives on a very day-to-day basis. Okay, it's the system. Okay, it's the power of the system, So I agree with you. Unfortunately, I mean, I experienced the other end. I come from a working class background in Liverpool, and the community I was raised in was leveled in order to make way for these highways. And I remember older people who were long-standing members of the church I went to. They were turfed out of their houses that they'd lived in for generations, and half of them were dead within a year. Right? And that was the result of decisions made by enlightened town planners, politicians, people who were designing the economic future with not a real concern for these people. These were the people who suffered. And so that was when I first realized the negative end of technology in my own life. These were, these were decisions made by technocrats, town planners we used to call them. Okay? And they had dire consequences which these people did not intend and were probably oblivious to. Okay? But as with the folks at the West End, it was the people on who suffered as a consequence of these new technologies their voices were not heard, and I think they need to be heard. But whether that will ever happen is another matter.
Last words? The one thing that struck me was, as I was listening to the three of you, is the use of the word order and how it factored into in the way all three of you thought about order, from the beehive, right, to the cell, and that it had order, and John's view of order. So as I think about your discussion or your provocations about technology, I'm walking out with another word, and it's the relationship between technology and order. So just sort of as a preset and presage to some comments I might have at the next session. And that's part of what this structure is about, is what we are going to do is reconvene and think about it as a reconvening on May 10th, back here in the same room, same theme, with a faculty member from CCM, from DAAP, and from physics. And take another 3 slices, if you will, of perspective on the thematic of technology and try to build off of what we heard today. So we invite you back for that. The provost also has graciously set up a little bit of a reception in the back, so I wanted to give us a little time to be able to have some conversations among each other. If I invite you to do one thing, it's shake hands with somebody that you don't know before you leave today. And we will see you back here on the 10th. Carlo, Christy, and John, a fabulous start, I think, to our thing. Thank you very much.